Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, thousands of years of recorded history were written almost entirely by men, about men, for men, and yet somehow the story of one enslaved Egyptian woman survived all of it. Why do you think her name was remembered when so many others were not? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. Her name appears only in records written by the people who owned her. That is where this story begins, not with a monument, not with a dynasty, not with a name carved into the face of a temple or pressed into clay by the hand of a scribe serving a king. It begins with a single clause in a text written by and for the household that held her in bondage, a clause that introduces her not as a person, but as a possession, not as someone who arrived somewhere, but as something that was already there, already allocated, already defined by her function, within a system that had no interest in anything else she might have been. She did not write her own story. She was not asked to. The ancient world almost never asked that question of enslaved women. It recorded them when they were useful to record and ignored them when they were not, and the vast administrative machinery of the ancient Near East, that relentless engine of tallies and inventories and household accounts, moved through the lives of women like her, the way the Nile moved through the flat fields of the Delta, without acknowledgement, without pause, leaving only the marks of its passage on the land it crossed. And yet her name is here. Her name is Hagar. She was Egyptian. She was enslaved. By every conventional measure of ancient record keeping, by the standards of an administrative apparatus that categorized women like her as mouths and hands and functions, that recorded what they produced and discarded what they experienced, she should not exist in the historical record at all. Queens survive in the archive by design. Generals survive by design. Priests and scribes and landowners survive by design, because the systems that produced those records were built to serve those categories of person. But an enslaved foreign woman with no political power, no institutional sponsorship, no lineage the preserving traditions considered primary, her survival is the anomaly this reconstruction is built around. Something happened, something the archive did not intend. What that something was and why it worked is a question that does not have a simple answer. But it begins, like most things that refuse to disappear, with a desert, and with water, and with a particular stubbornness of a real place that people kept returning to long after everyone involved had died. What follows is not myth. It is a reconstruction assembled from archaeological evidence, from the legal texts of the ancient Near East, from the administrative papyri of Middle Kingdom Egypt, from biblical scholarship and subaltern history and the emerging discipline of ancient women's studies, which attempts to recover the lived experience of those whom official record keeping was systematically designed to erase. It is, by necessity, incomplete. The gaps in Hagar's story are not accidents. They are the deliberate result of systems that were never designed to preserve what happened to women in her position, systems that recorded the outcomes of her existence without recording the experience of it, systems that noted what she produced for the household without ever once pausing to register what the household cost her. Those gaps are themselves a form of evidence. They are the shape of what was taken. To understand how Hagar came to exist within the record, to understand the mechanism of her preservation and the miracle of her survival in the archive, it is first necessary to understand the world that produced her. Egypt, in the period that scholars place between approximately 2,000 and 1,800 years before the Common Era, was the dominant civilizational force in the northeastern corner of Africa and the western edge of what is now called the Fertile Crescent. Its administrative apparatus was among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. It produced papyrus records of grain yields and labor allocations, household inventories and military tallies, letters between landowners and their agents that have survived in the dry air of the desert for 4,000 years and now sit in museums in New York and London and Cairo, still legible, still precise in their bureaucratic detail. Egypt knew how to record things. The question was always which things it chose to record. The empire's reach extended north into Canaan, the coastal and inland territory, corresponding roughly to modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of western Jordan and Syria. Trade moved through this corridor constantly. Merchants, diplomats, refugees, and migrant laborers traveled its roads and its sea routes, and with them moved a commodity that the ancient world managed with the same administrative precision it applied to grain and bronze and linen. Slaves moved through this corridor. They were captured in military campaigns from Nubia in the south, from Libya in the west, from the Levant and Canaan in the north and east. They were purchased in markets, received as diplomatic gifts, born into bondage within existing households, or acquired through mechanisms that the ancient texts describe with a vagueness that is itself a form of violence, referenced simply as having been given or obtained without further elaboration of the circumstances that produced the transfer. The institution of slavery in ancient Egypt was neither uniform nor static. Scholars including John A. Wilson, who wrote extensively on Egyptian social structure, and Andrea M. Guiniers, who has examined both military slavery and household bondage in the New Kingdom period, have traced the multiple categories of unfree labor that existed simultaneously within Egyptian society. There were prisoners of war redistributed into royal households and temple economies. There were debt slaves, free persons who had surrendered their labor indefinitely against obligations they could not repay. There were those born into bondage, whose status passed through the maternal line. And there were those who entered servitude through arrangements so normalized by the social structures around them that the texts recording those arrangements felt no need to explain the process. The archive recorded the outcome. The experience of the person at its center was considered irrelevant to the transaction. What the surviving papyri reveal, when read against the grain of their administrative purpose, is the sheer scale of this human machinery. Egyptian household accounts from the Middle Kingdom document enslaved workers in numbers that range from single digits in smaller private estates to hundreds within the large temple complexes and royal installations of the Delta. The Brooklyn Papyrus, a document from approximately 1800 years before the Common Era, lists by name and geographic origin more than 40 enslaved individuals within a single household, some from Nubia, some from the Levant, many simply categorized as Asiatic, which was the Egyptian administrative classification for Semitic-speaking peoples from the territories north and east of the Delta. Among these listings are women recorded by function rather than history. They are weavers, wet nurses, domestic workers. In some cases, they carry names, but those names are frequently Egyptian administrative names assigned upon acquisition, not the names they arrived with. The names they were born with, if those names entered any record at all, were considered irrelevant to the transaction and were therefore not preserved. Hagar's name, whatever form it took before she entered someone else's account of the world, may itself have been a name assigned rather than given. The archive recorded what was useful. Everything else was allowed to disappear. Hagar of Egypt almost certainly entered the household of a Semitic patriarch named Abram through one of these mechanisms. The primary textual source, the Book of Genesis, in its Hebrew form, introduces her with a single clause that has been translated across dozens of languages and analyzed across thousands of years of scholarship without resolving its fundamental opacity. Sarai had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. No age, no origin city, no family name, no account of how she came to be where she was or what that process cost her. The narrative moves past her acquisition, the way a household ledger moves past the listing of a clay vessel or a bolt of linen, noting its existence, recording its status, and proceeding to the next item. She was property. In the world the text was produced for, her acquisition required no more explanation than the acquisition of anything else. The household itself is described as originating from the region of Mesopotamia, the ancient river valley civilization centered on the Tigris and Euphrates, and traveling extensively through Canaan. The texts record at least one extended stay in Egypt proper, a stay during which the acquisition of Hagar is implied, though not directly stated. Whether she was purchased in a Delta market, received in a diplomatic exchange, seized through some legal mechanism of debt or dispute, or obtained by some other means, The text has chosen not to preserve, too. None of this is specified. What is specified is that she was Egyptian, that she was enslaved, and that she belonged to Sarai. Those three facts were sufficient for the purposes of the record. Everything else about her, her childhood, her language, her family of origin, the name she was given before she became property was considered irrelevant to the account and was therefore not included in it. This is the first of the erasures, and it operates so quietly, with such bureaucratic normalcy, that it is easy to miss its violence unless one pauses deliberately to register it. The violence is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is embedded in the structure of the sentence, in what is included and what is not, in the categories the record considers worth maintaining, and the categories it considers not worth the space on the papyrus. Hagar is introduced as a slave girl whose name was Hagar. The name is preserved. Everything that preceded the name every year of her life before she entered this household, every relationship and memory and experience that made her a person rather than a noun, is gone. Not because it was destroyed, because it was never recorded. Archaeologists working at sites across the ancient Near East have reconstructed, from the material evidence, what the world Hagar inhabited looked like in physical terms. At Nuzi, in what is now northern Iraq, thousands of clay tablets from the middle, second millennium before the Common Era document household arrangements that illuminate the legal and social context of the Genesis narrative with uncomfortable precision. Among these tablets are contracts governing the practice of surrogate motherhood in the context of infertile marriages, arrangements in which a slave woman was directed by her mistress to conceive a child with the household, patriarch, with the resulting child legally attributed to the wife. These arrangements appear not only in the Nuzi documents, but in Old Babylonian law codes and Assyrian legal texts. They were recognized. They were normalized. They were, in the world of elite household management in the ancient Near East, an ordinary transaction. The extraordinary thing, the thing that the clay tablets almost never record, was what it was like to be the slave woman at the center of one. The power dynamics of that arrangement deserve examination with precision, because they define the shape of everything that happened to Hagar and explain why the narrative holds the particular contours it does. In the ancient Near Eastern household economy, a slave woman had no recognized legal relationship with her own body. Her reproductive capacity was not considered her own. It belonged to the household in exactly the same sense that the household's livestock and grain stores and bronze implements belonged to it. When Sarai, having determined that she would not conceive, directed Hagar to lie with Abram so that Sarai might build a family through her. The text uses a specific Hebrew phrase meaning to be built up through her. This was not a request. There was no mechanism within the social architecture of that world by which Hagar could have refused. The concept of refusal did not exist as a legal category in her relationship to her mistress's authority. The household had an apparatus of power that was total, and Hagar's body existed within that apparatus, allocated according to its needs. The texts do not pause to register this. They do not need to. The absence of consent is not something the record considers requiring acknowledgement, because the consent of enslaved women to reproductive use was not a category that ancient Near Eastern law recognized. It was outside the frame of what the legal system considered relevant. The tablets from Nuzi, the law codes carved into black basalt, the administrative papyri from the Egyptian Middle Kingdom, none of them record the psychological or emotional experience of the slave women at the center of these arrangements. They record ownership, transfer, obligation, and outcome. The interior life of the enslaved is, in almost every case, simply not present. It was not considered data. It was not considered worth the clay. This is the horror that operates beneath the surface of Hagar's story, and it operates quietly, and it is precisely the quietness of it that is most difficult to hold in the mind. There is no single act of explicit brutality the text pauses over. There is no villain who announces his intentions. The violence is structural. It is in the architecture of the household and the legal codes of the civilization and the daily administrative logic of a world in which certain human beings had been defined before they arrived in any particular house as instruments of other people's purposes. Hagar did not need to be coerced in any dramatic sense. She simply existed within a system that had already decided before she was born what she was and what she was for. The household itself was a physical world as much as a legal one. Semitic pastoral households of the second millennium before the Common Era, reconstructed through archaeological work at sites in the Jezreel Valley, the Negev Highlands, and the Jordan River Basin, were built around central compounds of mud brick and stone, their walls thick enough to hold cool air through the middle of the day, their floors packed earth, worn smooth by years of foot traffic. The smell of such a compound was the smell of livestock and oil lamps, and the particular dry mineral scent of sun-heated mud brick. The sound was the sound of grinding stones in the early morning, of water being poured from clay vessels, of a household's daily operations moving through their assigned rhythms, before the heat of the day made movement difficult. This was the physical space Hagar occupied, not as a guest, not as a family member, but as labor. The compound she moved through was not hers. The grain she ground, the water she carried, the oil she poured into lamps that illuminated the rooms of the patriarch and his wife, none of it belonged to her in any sense the household recognized. She moved through that space the way the heat moved through it, present, necessary, and unremarked upon. She conceived. The text records this in the same flat administrative language it uses for everything else. And, in conceiving, something shifted, something the household management system had not fully anticipated and did not know how to contain. Because once Hagar was visibly pregnant, once it was undeniably apparent that she carried what the household had been seeking for years, something happened to the architecture of the hierarchy. The texts describe it obliquely. They say that Hagar began to regard her mistress with contempt, that she began to look at Sarai as something diminished. Scholars of biblical Hebrew who have examined this passage closely note that the word used, kalal, carries connotations of treating something as light or weightless that was previously treated as weighty and significant. What Hagar did, in the language of the text, was look at the woman who owned her and see her as less than she had been, as if the pregnancy had given Hagar a vantage point she had not previously been permitted. As if, for the first time, she had looked at the structure of her captivity from the outside and found it wanting. This detail is remarkable and has occupied scholars of biblical literature and ancient women's history for generations. Why was it preserved? Why record, in a narrative that otherwise shows almost no interest in Hagar's inner life, this single moment of apparent psychological assertion, this moment in which the enslaved woman stepped, briefly and dangerously, outside the psychological boundaries of her bondage? Phyllis Tribal, whose landmark examination of texts of terror in the Hebrew Bible remains among the most cited works in the field, and Renita Weems, who has written with particular acuity on the racial and social dynamics of the Hagar narrative, have both argued that this detail survives in the text precisely because it was threatening, because it was a problem the narrative needed to address. A slave who looked at her mistress with something other than deference was a slave who had momentarily claimed a form of authority the system said she was not supposed to have. The text preserved the moment because it needed to resolve it, and it resolved it in the way such moments were always resolved in that world, by force. Sarai turned not to Hagar but to Abram. She did not address the enslaved woman directly. She addressed the patriarch, because the patriarch was the locus of legal authority within the household, and the problem of Hagar's gaze was a legal problem as much as a personal one. Abram's response was immediate and complete. He handed Hagar back. A woman whose body he had used, who now carried his child, whom the household had instrumentalized for its own purposes, he returned her to Sarai's authority with 4 words in the original Hebrew that translate approximately as, "Do with her what seems good to you." He gave her back. And what Sarai did with that authority is described in the Hebrew with the word anah, a word that elsewhere in the biblical text describes affliction and humiliation. The suffering of enslaved peoples under conditions of forced labor and social degradation. It is not a gentle word. It does not describe a mild rebuke. Whatever Sarai did to Hagar in the period that followed, the outcome is specification enough. Hagar ran. She ran into the desert, into the wilderness of Shur, the northwestern region of the Sinai Peninsula, east of the Egyptian border, known from Egyptian administrative records as a landscape of limestone plateaus, sand flats, and near total absence of fresh water. Egyptian mining expeditions had operated in the Sinai since the early Bronze Age, extracting turquoise from the formations at Serabit el-Qadim and copper from the mines of Timna, and there were established routes across the peninsula used by nomadic Semitic groups and military patrols. But it was not a landscape that offered any particular hospitality to a pregnant woman traveling alone without supplies. The heat during the day reaches temperatures that are measurably dangerous to a body already under the physical stress of early pregnancy. The cold at night descends sharply. Water sources are separated by distances that, in the wrong season, cannot be covered by an unprepared traveler. Hagar ran into this landscape with, as far as the text indicates, nothing. The decision was not strategic. It was the decision of someone for whom the only available calculation was whether death in the desert was worse than whatever she was leaving behind. She determined that it was not, and she walked out into the sand. The physical landscape of the Sinai Desert, examined through the lens of archaeology and ancient geography, offers a specific and unforgiving kind of evidence. Expeditions conducted by the Israel Exploration Society and surveys associated with the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities have mapped the ancient routes across the northwestern peninsula, the paths along which water could theoretically be found, the locations of springs and seasonal pools and cisterns cut into rock by the accumulated labor of centuries of travelers who understood that the desert would kill anyone who moved through it without knowing where to look. These water sources were not evenly distributed. They were clustered around geological features, wadis, where runoff occasionally pooled, limestone formations that trapped groundwater in shallow basins, patches of vegetation that indicated moisture below the surface. A traveler with knowledge of these features had some chance. A traveler without that knowledge, moving without guidance across terrain she did not know, had almost none. The text records that Hagar was found beside a spring. The location is named Ein Mishpat, the Spring of Judgment, also identified as Kadesh, a site that appears repeatedly in ancient Near Eastern geographical texts, and that scholars have proposed corresponds to a location in the northeastern Sinai or the northern Negev. She had found water. Somehow, in that landscape, alone and without preparation, she had found the one resource without which everything else was irrelevant. Whether this was the result of navigation, of instinct, of a memory of Egyptian border geography that she carried from her country of origin, or of something else entirely, the text does not say. She was there. She was alive. In a desert designed to be a final destination for the unprepared, she was there beside the water, and she was breathing. What happens at that spring is the moment the narrative pivots on the encounter that has generated more theological interpretation and more scholarly debate than almost any other episode in the Hagar story. The text describes a divine messenger, a presence associated with the God of the Abram household, who speaks to Hagar directly, who addresses her by her name, not by her function, not by her status, not by her relationship to the household that owns her, but by her name, and who asks where she has come from and where she is going. The question is strange. It is not a request for geographical information. It is, in the interpretive framework of ancient Near Eastern encounter, narratives of which this is one of the oldest extant examples, an act of recognition. It is what it looks like when someone in a text that has been ignoring you suddenly turns and sees you. Hagar answers with what is true. She does not frame her situation in heroic terms. She does not appeal to injustice or make any claim on the attention of the divine presence other than the simple statement of fact. She is fleeing from her mistress, Sarai. She names the structure accurately. She is a slave. She is running from the person who holds authority over her. She has no destination because there is no destination available to her, no institution in the ancient world waiting to receive an escaped enslaved woman and offer her something other than punishment or return. The wilderness is not a destination. It is the only direction that is not back. The theological tradition records that she was told to return, that the divine presence instructed her to go back to the household and submit to Sarai's authority. This instruction has troubled readers of the text across thousands of years of interpretation, and it continues to trouble scholars today. It does not resolve the injustice of her situation. It does not punish those responsible for her suffering. It does not liberate her or alter the power structure that produced her pain. It sends her back into the system that harmed her and frames this return in terms of future promise that her son would become the patriarch of an uncountable lineage, that she would be a founding mother whose descendants would extend beyond the horizon of any reckoning. This promise does not give her freedom, but it gives her a future that exists outside the household's definition of what she is, and she responds to it in a way that the text, almost despite itself, records with something approaching awe. She names the encounter, she names the place. In a text that almost never records enslaved women exercising this kind of authority, Hagar gives a name to the divine presence that has spoken to her El Roi in the original Hebrew, meaning the God who sees me, and she names the spring where the encounter occurred, Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. This act of naming was not incidental in the ancient world. Naming was an act of authority. In the ancient Near East, the power to assign a name was inseparable from the power to define reality. The Egyptian creation texts understood speech itself, the act of naming things into existence, as the mechanism by which order was established from chaos. Ptah, in the Memphite theology inscribed on the Shabaka stone, creates the world through the utterance of names. This was not poetry. It was a cosmological statement about where power resided. When a pharaoh claimed a conquered territory, he renamed its cities. When a household acquired a slave, the first act of administration was frequently the assignment of a new name, one that marked the person as belonging to the household system, that severed the continuity of identity they had carried from wherever they came from. Names were not descriptive labels, they were instruments of control. To name something was to own the interpretation of it. Hagar, an enslaved woman with no legal standing, a foreigner in a landscape that was not her own, named a divine encounter and named a geographical site, and both names survived. They were preserved by traditions that were not her own, copied by scribes in communities that would not have recognized her right to the authority she exercised, transmitted across centuries in languages she never spoke. The names survived because they were attached to real things. The encounter was real enough to leave a mark. The spring was real enough that people kept returning to it. And when people kept returning to a spring, they kept repeating its name. And when enough people repeated a name long enough, it became very difficult to remove from the archive. She returned to the household. She bore a son. Abram named the child Ishmael, meaning, in Hebrew, God hears encoding in the official patriarchal naming the memory of what happened to Hagar in the desert, of the cry that was heard, of the encounter the household patriarch had not witnessed, but whose consequences he was now required to acknowledge. The child grew within the household for approximately 13 years. He was Abram's son. He was the only male heir, and for those 13 years, whatever Hagar's status within the household remained enslaved, foreign, defined by her function. She was the mother of the only child of the patriarch, and that was a form of presence, however precarious, however contingent, that the household could not simply set aside. The ancient Near Eastern legal texts are illuminating on this point. The Nuzi tablets document arrangements in which slave women who bore children to the patriarch occupied an intermediate position within the household hierarchy, neither fully enslaved nor fully free, neither wives nor strangers, existing in a legal category that the household management system had created to contain a situation it had itself produced. They could not be sold. They could not, in most documented cases, be expelled while the child was young. They could be mistreated. The same texts that restrict their sale frequently record no restriction on the forms their mistreatment could take. But they could not be simply removed from the account the way a vessel or a bolt of linen could be removed. The child made her permanent, provisionally, within a system that preferred to keep nothing permanent about her. 13 years is a long time to be permanent in that way. Long enough for the child to grow old enough that the question of what he would inherit, and from whom, and in competition with whom, would eventually become unavoidable. Then Sarai, by this point renamed Sarah, and Abram, renamed Abraham, by the same divine tradition that had spoken to Hagar in the desert, conceived and gave birth to a son of her own. The child was named Isaac, and from the moment of his birth, everything changed. The provisional structure that had permitted Hagar's son to occupy a place in the household's future collapsed. The text records that Sarah saw Ishmael playing with the infant Isaac, or, in some translations, laughing at him. In a few contested interpretations, mocking him, and went to Abraham with a demand that scholars of ancient Near Eastern household law have recognized as legally precise: cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave shall not inherit alongside my son Isaac. This was not emotional rage, though it may have contained rage. It was a legal maneuver. Sarah was invoking the right of the freeborn wife's child to uncontested inheritance, eliminating the legal ambiguity that Ishmael's existence created, using the mechanism available to her within the household's power structure to resolve a succession problem in her son's favor. Abraham complied. The texts record that he found this compliance painful, that he was distressed on account of the boy, but that the divine tradition again intervened to frame the expulsion in terms of promise, and that Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a water skin, placed them on Hagar's shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. The phrasing is precise and cold. He placed them on her shoulder, not in a bag, not on a cart, on her shoulder like a burden she was required to carry, because the household was not providing her with anything she could not carry on her own body. And then he sent her away, and she went out, and she wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, the northernmost edge of the Negev desert, south of Canaan, west of the Dead Sea, east of the Sinai. In the second millennium before the Common Era, it was an arid plateau of exposed limestone and scrubland, navigable by those with knowledge of its water sources and lethal by dehydration to those without. Archaeological excavations at Tel Sheva, the mound that corresponds to ancient Beersheba, have uncovered evidence of Bronze Age settlement centered entirely around the management of water. Cisterns cut deep into the bedrock, storage vessels concentrated near access points to the Wadi system, the physical evidence of a community organized around the constant, precarious problem of finding enough to drink. The distance from the settlement center to the nearest reliable water source in the dry season has been estimated by field researchers at more than 3 kilometers a distance that, under the thermal conditions of a Negev summer, an adult carrying a child could cover in approximately an hour. What that hour would cost the body, in heat and exertion, and the accelerating depletion of the water already consumed, the settlement's architecture understood clearly enough to build its entire existence around solving. She had a water skin, one skin, for herself and a child in a landscape where the distance between water sources could exceed what an adult under optimal conditions could safely travel, let alone a woman carrying a child on her shoulder and a skin of water on her back in the heat of a Negev morning. The mathematics of her survival, examined dispassionately, were not favorable. The water ran out. The texts record what happened next with a restraint that is almost harder to read than explicit description would be. When the water in the skin was finished, she put the child under one of the bushes, a low thorn bush, probably, offering perhaps an inch or two of shade in a landscape with almost no other cover, and she walked away, about the distance of a bow shot, which archaeologists and biblical geographers estimate as somewhere between 40 and 100 meters. And she sat down opposite him, and she said, "Let me not look upon the death of the child." Here the text creates a tension that scholars of the Genesis narrative have identified as one of its most debated compositional puzzles. Ishmael, by the timeline the text itself establishes, would have been approximately 13 to 15 years old at the time of this expulsion. Not an infant to be sheltered under a bush, but a teenager capable of independent movement. The detail of Hagar placing the child under a thorn bush and walking away to a distance of a bow shot reads, textually, as the behavior of a mother with an infant too young to walk. Most biblical scholars interpret this as evidence of textual layering two separate tradition strands describing different moments in Hagar's story, combined in the written text without full harmonization of the chronological details. What the inconsistency reveals is not a flaw in the account, but a seam. A place where the oral traditions that fed the written narrative did not originate in the same community or the same moment. She was preparing to watch her son die. She could not prevent it, and she could not look at it, so she placed herself at a distance where she could hear him but not see him, where the last sound of him would reach her, without the last sight of him destroying something she needed to keep intact. She had found no water, she had no resources remaining. She was alone in a desert, enslaved in status even in her expulsion, in a landscape that had already nearly killed her once. And she cast the child under the bush, and she sat down in the sand at a distance of a bow shot, and she raised her voice and wept. The text records that she raised her voice and wept, not that she prayed, not that she made a formal appeal or performed a ritual supplication. She wept. This is one of the only moments in the entire Hagar narrative where the text abandons its administrative composure and allows, for a few words, the interior experience of the enslaved woman to be visible. Not her theological function, not her legal status, not her household role or her reproductive outcome, or her relationship to the patriarchal lineage, her experience. She was sitting in the sand in the Negev desert, listening to her son, and she wept because there was nothing else left in the world to do. And this is where the question that opened this account finally arrives with its full weight. She should not be here. Not in the desert, though the desert should have taken her twice. Not in the record. A woman sitting in the sand at a bow shot's distance from her dying child, weeping because there was nothing else left to do, is not the kind of figure that ancient archives were built to preserve. She held no political office. She controlled no land. Her son's lineage is the one the text most carefully distinguishes from its primary concern. The communities that preserve this narrative had every institutional reason to let her dissolve into the background of the account to note her as a function, a vessel, a mechanism for producing the child, and then to allow her to fade. And for thousands of years, scholars of the traditions that preserved her story largely did exactly that. She appeared in commentaries as a symbol, an allegory, a problem to be resolved. What she was, a specific Egyptian woman, in a specific desert, in a specific moment of extremity, was treated as secondary to what she was thought to represent. She survived the archive not because the archive chose her. She survived because she left marks on the physical world that proved more durable than the silence the archive preferred. What those marks were, and how they outlasted everything the system that produced them intended, that is what the rest of this account is about. The theological tradition records that the child's voice was heard, not Hagar's weeping, the text specifies, but the child's cry, and that Hagar's eyes were opened to a well of water. Scholars have written at length about this opening of eyes, about what it implies regarding the well's prior existence and Hagar's prior inability to perceive it. Archaeological surveys of the Beersheba Basin have identified ancient water sources from the Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age springs and cisterns that would not have been visible on the surface to a traveler who did not know where to look, whose presence would have required either local knowledge or a very particular combination of light and terrain angle to detect. The possibility that Hagar, at the extreme edge of dehydration and grief, had stopped within reach of water she could not see is not theologically impossible and not archaeologically implausible. Whether she found it by divine intervention, by Egyptian knowledge of the Sinai border geography she had carried from her country of origin, by the desperate perceptual clarity that sometimes attends extreme physical need, or by some combination of all of these, the text does not resolve. What the text records is the outcome. She filled the skin with water. She gave the child water. They lived. What follows is the passage in the narrative that most commentaries pass over quickly, and that deserves much more attention than it typically receives. The text records that as the boy grew, Hagar took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. She chose his wife, an Egyptian slave woman, expelled without resources into the desert, who had survived not once but twice, who had named a spring and named a god, and been sent out of two households in the same generation. That woman reached back into the country that had produced her and made a choice that would determine the lineage her son established. She exercised maternal authority. She reached past everything that had been done to her, past every mechanism of erasure and expulsion that the household and its world had applied to her, and made a decision that would echo forward in history. The founders of the Ishmaelite Confederation, the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula and the Sinai region, whom the text associates with her son's lineage, carried Egyptian blood through Hagar's choice. The patriarchal text preserves this fact while managing to minimize the woman who made it possible, but it cannot remove her from the account, because she is the account. Take her out, and the lineage has no origin. Take her out, and the spring at Bir Lahai Roi has no name. Take her out, and the narrative has a hole in it that the traditions that came after have never successfully filled. This is the question that scholars of subaltern history, the history of those whom official records were designed to exclude, return to again and again when they examine the Hagar narrative. Why was she kept? Why did the traditions that preserve the Abraham story, traditions produced entirely by communities descended from the Abraham household, communities with profound institutional interest in narratives that centered the patriarchal line and the lineage of Isaac and the covenant that the text says was established through that lineage. Why did those traditions keep Hagar? She serves no obvious theological purpose for them. Her son's lineage is explicitly distinguished from the lineage the text most cares about. Her presence does not shore up any dynastic claim or institutional priority of the preserving communities. In the strictest economy of narrative, she is unnecessary, and yet she is there. Her name is preserved. Her words at Bir Lahai Roi are preserved. Her weeping in Bir Sheba is preserved. Her act of choosing a wife for her son from Egypt is preserved. She is in the text in a way that cannot be surgically removed without damaging the structural coherence of what remains. Phyllis Tribal has argued that Hagar functions as what she calls an unabsorbable remainder, a figure the tradition could not fully process or contain, whose presence in the text generates a disturbance precisely because she does not fit the categories the text is built to serve. She is not the mother of the chosen lineage. She is not a villain whose punishment the narrative requires. She is not a symbol with a clean allegorical purpose. She is a specific, named, feeling human being who was enslaved and used and expelled, and who survived, who did something in the desert that a divine tradition felt compelled to record as significant, and whose significance could not be excised from the archive without leaving marks that would themselves require explanation. The tradition kept her because it was too late not to. She had already named a spring in a real desert, and the desert had remembered, and the remembering had made it into writing before anyone could decide to exclude it. A spring with a name is a geographical fact. Geographical facts are harder to erase than people. The interpretive traditions that accumulated around her story, across the centuries, each processed her through the lens of their own priorities. The Jewish Midrashic literature engaged with her story, and her identity, and her relationship to the covenant narrative. Some Midrashic texts identify her as the daughter of Pharaoh himself, a tradition that has no basis in the Genesis account, but that reflects the ongoing interpretive pressure to elevate a figure the plain text had left unresolved. The Christian patristic commentators found in her an allegory that served their theological project, reading her and Sarah as symbols in a framework that further obscured the specific human being at the center of the account. But it is the Islamic tradition that preserved Hagar, known there as Hajar, with the greatest intensity, and that transformed the material fact of her survival into something that has lasted longer and reached further than any other aspect of her story. The sa'i, the ritual walking 7 times between the hills of Safa and Marwa during the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, is understood in Islamic tradition as the ritualized memory of Hajar's desperate search for water in the desert, the memory of her running between 2 elevations hoping to catch sight of a caravan or a water source while the infant Ishmael lay on the ground below. It is worth noting here that the geographic identification of the wilderness where this search occurred is itself contested between traditions. The Genesis narrative places the wilderness of Paran in a location that most biblical geographers associate with the northern Sinai Peninsula, a region Hagar, as an Egyptian, would have known. The Islamic tradition, by contrast, locates Hajar's desert ordeal in what is now the Hijaz region of the Arabian Peninsula, in the valley that became Mecca, a divergence that reflects not a factual error on either tradition's part, but the reality that different communities carried different fragments of the same story forward, each anchoring it to the geography most sacred to their own inheritance. Both traditions are preserving Hagar. They are simply preserving different moments of her, or preserving the same moment through the lens of landscapes that matter to the people doing the preserving. The Zamzam well, which Islamic tradition holds, was the water source revealed to Hajar in the desert, and which continues to draw pilgrims at the center of the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, is among the most visited sacred sites on earth. Its water is carried home by pilgrims in bottles and flasks and distributed to the sick and the dying as a substance of profound spiritual significance. The tradition that the water in that well is connected, in theological continuity, to the water that saved an Egyptian slave woman and her child in a desert more than 3,000 years ago. That tradition has been maintained by hundreds of millions of people across 14 centuries without interruption. More than 2 million pilgrims perform the sa'i each year during the Hajj. It is among the most widely enacted religious rituals on the planet, and it is, explicitly and deliberately, the institutionalized memory of an enslaved woman's survival. An enslaved Egyptian woman who was used by her household, expelled by her household, abandoned by every structure the ancient world offered to the vulnerable, and who survived anyway. Her desperation in a desert is now one of the most repeated physical acts in human religious practice. The math of that survival across millennia of attempted erasure is staggering. In the Egyptian administrative record of the Middle Kingdom period in the Hekanakht Papers, a collection of household management letters dating to approximately 2,000 years before the Common Era that now reside at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There are references to enslaved women who are identified only by their function or their geographic origin. They are listed as mouths to feed or hands available for labor. The archive records their allocation without recording their experience. It notes what was done with them without preserving what it felt like to have those things done. It is an archive built on the assumption that the experience of enslaved women was not information, that it did not need to be retained because it had no value in any of the calculations the archive was designed to serve. The Hekanakht letters are particularly instructive because they document not an exceptional household, but an ordinary one, a middle-tier agricultural landholder writing to his family about crop yields and ration allocations and the management of his staff during a period when he was away on priestly duties. These were not the records of a palace or a temple. They were the records of a household that functioned the way most households of that class functioned, and they are preserved only because the dry air of the Theban burial shaft where they were found happened to keep them intact for 4,000 years. They survived by accident. The women in them survived only as functions. Hundreds of such documents exist across the span of Egyptian history. Thousands of women exist in them as line items rather than as people, allocated rather than remembered, their labor carefully noted and their lives entirely absent. Hagar's name did not come from an archive like that. It came from a narrative tradition that was designed for entirely different purposes and that preserved her, almost accidentally, as a specific individual within a theological account that was primarily about someone else. But those administrative papyri, those household management letters and labor tallies and grain allocation records, provide the material context in which her existence must be understood. She was one of thousands of enslaved Egyptian women whose lives moved through exactly that kind of administrative logic, whose bodies and labor and reproductive capacity were managed with the precision of an empire that was very good at recording the things it considered worth recording. She is the one whose name came through, not because the archive chose her, because she named a spring in the desert that people kept returning to for water, and every time they returned, they repeated her name, and the repetition outlasted the systems that tried to contain her. The well of the living one who sees me, Bir Lahai Roy. The site appears again in the Genesis narrative, associated with later figures in the patriarchal lineage. It becomes a place people return to, a recognized landmark in the landscape of the ancient Negev. A spring with a name that travelers and traders and nomadic peoples moving through that region knew. A name that carried within it, in compressed form, the memory of the woman who gave it. A memory durable enough to outlast the dynasty that owned her, outlast the language she spoke as a child in Egypt, outlast the social structure that produced her bondage, outlast the household that used and expelled her, outlast the specific theological traditions that recorded her encounter at the spring, and arrive, still attached to her name, in the 21st century of the Common Era, where it sits in university library databases and graduate seminar syllabi and the physical itineraries of millions of pilgrims who walk the hills of Mecca each year in deliberate, ritualized memory of the moment she refused to disappear. She was erased. And she was not erased. Both things are simultaneously and permanently true, and the tension between them is why her story still produces in its readers something that most ancient historical accounts do, not a specific, unresolvable discomfort that is itself a form of recognition. She did not survive in the archive because of power or wealth or political significance. She did not survive because any institution decided she was worth keeping. She survived because the systems that tried to contain and erase her made marks on the physical world, a named spring, a named god, a named well, a lineage attached to real geography in a real desert, and those marks were too permanent and too widely known and too deeply embedded in the landscape to remove. She survived because truth, when it is specific enough and grounded enough in an actual physical place that people keep returning to, is extremely difficult to bury completely, even under 3,000 years of sand. Even under the accumulated weight of traditions that were not hers, and records that were never written for her, and archives that were built on the assumption that what she experienced did not constitute information worth retaining, the spring at Bir Lahai Roy has not been definitively located by modern archaeology. Several sites have been proposed, none has been conclusively confirmed. The landscape that would have held it, the northeastern Sinai, the northern Negev, the border zone between Egyptian administrative territory and the Canaanite interior, has been surveyed, excavated, and mapped across more than a century of archaeological work, and the spring has not surfaced from any of it with the certainty the texts imply it deserves. It may be buried, it may have dried. It may be precisely where people have always said it is, waiting for the right season and the right instrument and the right question. But the water itself, the water that feeds whatever remnant of that source still exists, the water that pushed upward through limestone 4,000 years ago when Hagar found it, is still there. Somewhere in that rock, still finding its way toward the surface the way water always does, indifferent to the arguments about where it is and to whom it belongs and what it means. The name of the woman who found it and named it is still attached to it, in texts that were never written to honor her. That, in the end, is perhaps the most precise answer available to the question of how she survived. She survived because she was real, because the desert was real, because the water was real, and because real things, when enough people witness them and repeat their names often enough across enough generations, eventually become very difficult to pretend never existed, even for an archive that never wanted them there in the first place. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, to the ones that almost did not make it through, to the names that the record tried to lose and could not consider subscribing, there are many more of them, buried, waiting, not yet fully understood.